All right, ladies and gentlemen, so today we are going to start talking about evolution, and in that sense, we're going to take a look at chapter 25 in your textbook. Just a heads up, I'm going to split this chapter into two sections as far as notes go. I just kind of like the way that I had organized it before the edition of your textbook came out. So just be aware that we're not going to cover all of chapter 25 in this particular section here. We'll come back to it later in the unit. But what we are going to do is talk about the history of life on Earth. So before we can really get into Darwin and the theory of evolution and natural selection, we really need to take a step back and just look at how life got here in the first place. So that's where we're going to start today. So in order to look at all of this life on Earth and discuss the changes that have occurred from early life forms until what we see now, these past organisms, when we start digging back into evolutionary history, a lot of them are very different from the organisms that we see alive today. We look at the fossil record, and that fossil record's a great example of macroevolution. So seeing these changes on big scales, on species level scales, how big structures have changed, how we've had new organisms appear, how they've disappeared. So that fossil record's a great macroevolutionary large scale change. And all of those scales that we're looking at in that fossil record are mass extinctions, all kinds of fun stuff. But it really is geologic events that ultimately alter the environment. And as a result, those changes in those environments are what is going to cause the change in species. So it really is a matter of changing the course of biological evolution. So very much so, geologic events are tied to evolution. That being said, these living things also live on this planet, and as a result, they change their environment too. So it's a lot of interplay between geology and biology going on at evolutionary levels. So when we look at this changing life, all right, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that chemical and physical processes on Earth aided in the production of very simple cells in four sort of main stages. So we know that when Earth was initially formed, life didn't exist. So the big question then is, how did it get here? And there's a lot of hypotheses that we can talk about. We'll talk about a few of them here. But overarchingly, scientists agree that there's four main stages that would have needed to happen in this sequential order to get us to something that resembles life. First and foremost, we need some sort of synthesis of small organic molecules. So simple sugars, basic genetic material, that sort of thing. Then we're going to take those small organic molecules, and those small molecules have to start joining together to make more complex ones. So remember a little bit of your biochemistry, right? Monomers are single building blocks, right? So a single glucose is a monomer, and we're going to put those monomers together through chemical reactions to form polymers, so long chains. So taking something like a monomer of glucose, stringing it together, and making a polymer such as starch. Okay, it's a big long chain of glucose molecules. Once we have that process in place, then we've got to start packing those molecules into closed off internal environments. And so we're going to talk a little bit about protocells. And protocells, proto is sort of like pre, so these are pre-cells. They're not functional, they're not going to look like the cells that we're used to talking about in biology class, but they're a precursor to that. And so by being able to package those molecules into those protocells, I now allow for chemical reactions to happen more easily because I'm allowing chemicals to be closer together to bump into each other. We're shielding them from external environments that might be inhibited or influenced by pH changes or salt changes or all those sorts of things. So we package them up and we can control that environment much more readily. And then once we get to that point, then there needs to be some way for these things to self-replicate. Okay, and so some sort of genetic material or set of instructions needs to be present in order to consistently replicate that thing over and over again and replicate it not only consistently but accurately. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. Okay, based on geologic records, we know that Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. And it was a harsh environment at this point. So when we look at the origins of the solar system, it really is just all this gas and dust and rock just flying around in this disk. And that disk is what ultimately becomes the plane of our solar system. As these rocks and dust and ice and gas are all bombarding each other, they're hitting each other with so much force that they basically go molten, they go liquid. And that liquid then is capable of sticking together. And the more that we hit each other, the more that these things collide with each other, the bigger and bigger these masses are that get created. And eventually, enough of that settles out to be the planets that we know, Earth being one of them. So we know based on geologic record and based on just how planets form, that Earth would have been bombarded by this rock and this ice probably anywhere from about 4.2 to 3.9 billion years ago. And as a result of those large impacts, any sort of water that would have been on the surface would have just constantly gotten vaporized and gotten trapped back in the atmosphere. So there really were no oceans pre 3.9 billion years ago. Once we get to about 3.9 billion years, then all of that stuff floating around, colliding in the disk of the solar system sort of has settled out. It's attached itself. We've gotten the basic forms of our planets by that point. At which point, things on Earth start to settle down a little bit. When we look at records of early atmospheric conditions, we know that that atmosphere was incredibly thick, lots of water vapor, right? Because I can't allow any of it to really condense and stick onto the surface, so there's lots of it up in the atmosphere. Tons of other chemicals are being released, so not only are we getting hit with stuff, but being bombarded by that rock and ice from the solar system is also causing a lot of geologic activity, mainly volcanic activity. So there's all sorts of eruptions going on, and every time that those happen, they also spew all sorts of chemicals into the atmosphere as well, things like nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, so on and so forth. Once everything settles out into the solar system and we've got the basic planets forming, things here on Earth also are able to calm down. And as that happens, not only does that really hot temperatures that's going on because we're vaporizing so much stuff by being hit by rock and ice, all of that stuff starts to cool down. Earth as a whole starts to cool down a little bit. We get a more solid crust to form, and a lot of that water vapor that's stuck in the atmosphere starts to condense. When it condenses, it rains down on the surface, and that's where we get our big oceans. Also in that process, a lot of the hydrogen in the atmosphere ended up escaping back out into space. So let's fast forward for a second, because everything I'm talking about is kind of just conjecture, right? For most of our history, we had no idea what was happening. Okay, and there's lots of geologists that go on that start sort of breaking the mold of Earth only being a few thousand years old, and our understanding of plate tectonics and so on and so forth. So where does this start tying into biology? Well, let's go to the 1920s. And we're looking at these two gentlemen, Alpern and Haldane, and they are both working independent of each other, but they both come to the same conclusion, and they suggest that early Earth's atmosphere must have been a reducing environment. And if you don't really know what that means chemically, a redox reaction, oxidation versus reduction, and we'll get to that when we get to metabolism at this point in the year. But what this means is that the elements and the atoms that are in the atmosphere at this point are electron adding, meaning that they're taking electrons from other things. Okay? That's going to be necessary in order for these organic compounds to start forming. Okay? So it's a reducing environment. It's going to set up the conditions that might be possible for organic compounds to start forming. The other thing with this is in order to move electrons around, in order to break bonds, recreate them, energy is going to have to be involved. Okay? Any chemical reaction requires energy input to break bonds so that we can rearrange things and create new compounds. So these two gentlemen suggest where that energy could come from. Remember that early Earth is incredibly violent, all right, not only in the fact that we're being hit with things, but also in the fact that we've got volcanic eruptions, which are spewing things into the atmosphere, which is also going to be incredibly disturbing to those atmospheric conditions. So lots of storms as well, so lots of lightning. Also, that early atmosphere is not going to have an ozone layer. Okay, that's going to come back up a little later as well. If you know anything about our ozone layer's job is to protect us from UV radiation from the sun. Well, there's no ozone layer at the beginning, so there's lots of intense UV radiation coming in as well. So the energy to do all this rearranging of atoms and molecules likely came, at least in their hypothesis, from lightning and intense UV radiation. So they suggest this primordial soup model, where those early oceans, along with all of these chemicals that would have been raining into those early watery environments, along with the lightning and the UV radiation, could set up this ability to create these molecules in the oceans. So now we jump forward in time to 1953, where we finally get a lab experiment that puts this Opera and Haldane primordial soup model to the test. And this experiment is conducted by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. What they did was take the apparatus that you see right here, all right, and attempted to recreate as comparable as possible the conditions that we would have expected to see on early Earth. So this was sort of your primordial oceans. Remember, it's really kind of hot on early Earth, so that's hence this flame source, and that's going to cause a lot of evaporation to occur. That water vapor would have ended up into the simulated atmosphere here, so things like hydrogen gas, ammonia, methane, all these sort of things that we would have been seeing from things like volcanic eruptions. They include the electrodes here to simulate things like that UV radiation and that lightning. We allow that to go through a condenser, just like rain would have condensed out of the atmosphere and back into the oceans. And in the process of allowing sort of that moisture and that material to end up back into their simulated ocean, they also were able to take samples for chemical analysis. And what they ended up discovering in that sample bottle was a variety of organic materials, namely amino acids, which, if you remember what amino acids are back to your biochemistry, amino acids are the building blocks for proteins. So proteins really drive almost everything functional and structural in living things. So that was a really big, exciting find. And so what they concluded is that Operin and Haldane's hypothesis of the ocean sort of being this soup of really early building blocks for complex organic molecules seemed to hold up. It seemed possible that the conditions on early Earth could have potentially given rise to those organic compounds. That being said, not the only hypothesis out there. Things like the bubble models showed up in the 1980s, kind of similar to the idea of what Alperin and Haldane were suggesting, what Miller and Urey were suggesting, but rather than the bulk of the chemical reactions happening up in the atmosphere, instead they suggested the vast majority was still going on in the oceans themselves, more specifically near submerged volcanoes and deep sea vents, But the idea is basically the same, that the compounds that were coming out of these volcanoes and these vents had the elements, excuse me, necessary, along with energy to rearrange and eventually kind of happen onto the organic molecules that we know to be sustainable for life. Some other hypotheses out there. There's some suggestions that perhaps those organic compounds may have come from space itself, right? We're being hit by all of these rocks and ice and debris as the solar system is forming. And so there's some question as to perhaps that's where the carbon based molecules that we know to be life sustaining might have come from. What's their evidence? Well, they're looking at meteorites that hit Earth now. And what they end up finding are these compounds called carbonaceous chondrites. And we find these in the rocks. Anywhere from about 1 to 2% of the carbon compounds by mass in those meteorites are these carbonaceous chondrites. And there's some suggestion perhaps that was where those original carbon sources might have come from. Remember, we're carbon-based life forms, right? All of our biochemistry is based on carbon chemistry, so perhaps that's where those molecules could have originated from. Where do we start looking? Where do we keep looking? Where do we keep researching? And one of those places really is to start looking out into the solar system and out into the universe as to how life might exist elsewhere. All right, if we can find life in other planets, or at least evidence to suggest life might have existed somewhere else, then maybe that gives us some additional data to start drilling into how life got started here on Earth. So we're looking at places like Mars. Okay. Um, Most scientists don't really seem to think that there's anything big macroscopic like us, but um, the possibility for microbial life, right, bacteria and that sort of thing, seems likely. At least that's what scientists seem to think. Particularly interested in places like the ice cores where there's a lot of water. Europa, same deal. It's basically an icy moon, but underneath it is a big ocean. So, could there potentially be microbial life hanging out there? We're looking at it. Exoplanets. All right, and this whole idea of studying astrobiology. So, taking astronomy and biology and mixing it together, we're looking at exoplanets, so planets outside of our solar system, out in the universe, that fall within what we call the habitable zone. And what that really just means is that they're close enough to their star to be warm enough to support life like we're used to seeing here on Earth, but not so close that it's too hot and not so far away that it's too cold. So there really seems to be, at least based on our understanding here from Earth, this kind of happy zone, what they call the habitable zone, in order for life to potentially thrive and exist. At least life as we know it here. Other things they're looking at are their atmospheric conditions, right? We're able to study those even here from Earth based on spectral analysis. We're looking for water and we're looking for oxygen. All right, and those seem to be two major indicators for the potential for life. And we'll get into, when we talk about photosynthesis and the evolution of that process, why that might be a good indicator that life could potentially exist elsewhere.